Wonderful. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. How are we all feeling today? Good. Paul is exceptionally excited. Thank you all so much for coming out this Thursday afternoon. I love seeing a crowd full of smiles. And so we're going to dig into this book. It is incredible. How many of you have it already? Have listened to the audio book? And you've been inspired. Awesome. I'm gonna do my best to not hog the conversation and make sure that there's time for your questions, but I'm gonna get my questions in first. All right, just to give you a little bit about myself, just so you have some information and let you know what is happening here in the Capital Region. This is a not so shameless plug. As Paul mentioned, I am the CEO of the Albany Black Chamber of Commerce and Social Club. I attended college in Atlanta, Georgia, a historically black college and university called Clark Atlanta University. We sit on the campus of Morehouse College, Spelman College, Morris Brown College, NCAU. My entire goal and objective when I was in Atlanta was to figure out how do I take that workplace environment, that culture in the city and replicate it here in Albany, in the Capital Region. And so while it took me 16 years to figure out what that would look like, I figured it out, right? I was offered this exceptional opportunity to be a part of the Albany Black Chamber of Commerce, which is on Washington Avenue. So whenever you all have an opportunity to go online, look it up, I want to make sure that we're connected with all of the young professionals here. There's 22 higher ed institutions, and I want to make sure you all know that post-graduation, you don't have to leave to be successful. You can put your talent right here. So, all right, enough about that.
Love that.
Samhita, welcome to your alma mater. Welcome back home.
Thank you.
To have you here, and I'm happy to jump right into it. So we're going to do just that. So, your book, well, let me say, I was very happy to get the call to moderate this conversation, but I had no idea. Just by, of course, reading the book, I said, okay, this will be a nice read. It'll likely be mainstream, right? And I could, learn a thing or two. But diving into it, I literally felt like she was writing to me, right? Yeah. This is almost the exact experience I feel like I'm having in my career at this time. And so I want to take a lot of those themes and those topics and discuss them more thoroughly today. First things first, themes of feminism and the workplace challenges. So, first question is, your book explores the myth of making it in the marketplace. How do you define success in today's career landscape, especially for women? And what does making it truly mean in a world still grappling with inequality?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that introduction. I just love your energy. I'm so excited to be here, and it's so good to be back. I love coming back, and this building did not exist when I was in college. Everyone's like, this probably wasn't here in the olden days, because it was the olden days. The tunnels were still open back then, y'all. And for some reason, the quads seem smaller. Like, it was really hard to get to class back then. Maybe you can relate to that. So yeah, I mean, really thinking about this question of, what does it mean to make it? And one of the things, and I really appreciate, you feeling that you saw yourself in the book, because as I like to say to a lot of young women, I wrote this book for us. I really wrote this book for us. And I think that a lot of people write these career books who, on the outside, it certainly looks like on paper that I made it, right? I mean, I started at UAlbany. I was not a straight A student. I was a struggling student, and I found a home in the Women's Studies department here and mentorship and community, and that really helped me find my voice. But I didn't really start writing until I was in my 30s. And I started, as an independent journalist, and then ended up the number 2 at a major publication. Working for The Devil Wears Prada, and for all intents and purposes, I made it, right? And so I could have easily just written a book of here's how I did it, and I overcame everything, and I'm a star. And it was really important that I not write that book, because I felt like one of the really big shortcomings of a lot of books about women's success is, if you just do this, or if you just hustle a little harder, if you just work a little harder, or like, you know, people will literally be like, well, if you want to do all of it, get up at 4 a.m. and that's when you work out, and that's when you do this, and then you take care of your kid. And I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, we're still telling people they have to absorb every single thing in our society that has fallen apart, right? Like lack of affordable childcare, lack of affordable schooling, you know, lack of just like a job that has any boundaries whatsoever. And the expectation is we just absorb all of that. And so I really wanted to kind of take into, you know, really challenge this idea of what success ultimately means and what we sacrifice when we are, quote, making it, and how, depending on who you are and what you have access to and the kinds of support you have, that's going to look really different for you. And the caveat, which I think is kind of at the core of your question around inequality, is while some of us can have this kind of armchair conversation about, you know, well, I'm redefining what ambition means to me, many of us are just trying to make it, right? Like, we're just trying to make enough money to make ends meet. We're just trying to find that entry-level job. We're just trying to get that internship. I mean, I think at this point, like, one thing that I feel is so profoundly different from my generation to now, I think, undergrads, there's this idea that, like, you know what you're going to do after you graduate, and you know, and it's like, it was kind of expected in the 90s that you had a couple of years to find yourself. Like, people were doing, I did AmeriCorps, people did Peace Corps, you know, you traveled, you backpacked, and it wasn't as expensive then, right? It cost me $250 to fly to London. Can you even imagine that? Like, that's inconceivable, right? And so I think this idea that you have to have it all figured out, and like by 25 you know who you are. And really, that's only possible if you have some resources and some support and the right networks, and, you know, and so that was really all of the different things I was thinking about.
I love that. I was actually going to have a part 2 to that first question. You spoke about you not being writing right until the age of 30. I think so often because of this ambitious complex, and it's go to college and, you know, do all the right things. I was that student. I high performed. I was in all the clubs. I did all the right things. And I got to my senior year. I did my thesis. I graduated. I was in the middle, cum laude. And so I knew that landing a role, or kind of my dream, or at least I expected, would just come. And when I was met with no offers, because I was now, right, in a pool of people who were like me and even better, right? And so what would you say to that student looking at your career, having that hindsight now, about the pressures of feeling like you have to have it all right at graduation?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the most exciting things that's happening right now with younger generations is a lot of people are turning their back on that narrative. I do think that, you know, I am a Gen Xer. Like, I'm like the youngest of the Gen Xers. Some call me a geriatric millennial. You know, we were kind of just like, work hard, play hard. You know, this is the cost of success. Like, you don't have boundaries. You do what you need to do. Like, the rest of y'all are soft. Like, you would never survive the asylum I came up in. That type of attitude, right? Which is not inaccurate. You know. And then I think the next generation, and there's been quite a bit of work around this, right? The burnout generation, right? Millennials were kind of taught that they were the special ones, and that they needed to like work at McKinsey by 23, and they, you know, had to have it all figured out. And so now you're seeing that a lot of that generation is struggling with mental health issues, on top of the financial issues that come with burning out really early, and, you know, all of that. And many of them, and I also am part of this, are the sandwich generation, where they're also having to take care of their parents because we have, you know, no social safety net, and then they're also taking care of their children. And so I do think the like next generation is kind of looking at those two generations, and they're like, why? Like, we're not going to do that. We're not going to work ourselves and sacrifice everything. And so, you know, I do think that a lot of people do have that anxiety and that pressure, but I will say that one thing that I think is very exciting is that I am seeing young people are asking questions about labor and the expectations we have around hustle culture in a way that I think the rest of us were almost afraid to ask those questions. That said, as someone who manages teams of young people, you know, I do think that I think that right now it's really easy to say that nothing about the system works, and we should just quiet quit, and we should just, you know, what are all the other terms that, you know, and I think we're kind of at this place where we have to find a middle ground of like, the things anybody wants, it doesn't matter what you do for a living, people want purpose in their life. The idea of quiet quitting or just calling it in or not being ambitious, I think we're having this moment, it's a little bit of a backlash against ambition. And I understand it. I think it makes sense. And I understand it, but I can't relate to it because I write books and I work and and I'm very ambitious and I understand what it's taken to do all of that. And my hope is, especially for this new generation, is that it gets easier to be ambitious, right? It doesn't have to come at such a great cost to our mental, emotional, and spiritual health. And I think that the thing that I have learned most, and I would say, is it's okay to make a ton of mistakes. It's okay to, someone just introduced themselves to me who I know through distant from my first job, which was living on the Clearwater, which went up and down the Hudson River as an environmental educator. And I used to work on the 86th floor of the World Trade Center for a publication before Teen Vogue, and I would see the boat going by, and it was this constant reminder of where I started and where I ended up. And that every one of those steps are going to be meaningful, whether they feel meaningful or not. And even doing a job you absolutely hate or is not your dream job is actually going to give you tools to figure out what that is. And rather than feeling like you have to have it all figured out in that first moment, allow yourself to make those mistakes. Get that boss that sucks. Find out what your boundaries are. Know what you like to do. Work too hard on a project that fails. Yes. And see how that feels. You will learn something from that.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I was just expressing to someone the other day that coming back home, there's a maintenance company called Janitronics, and they came to the building that I'm working at, and I used to work for them. I literally cleaned the toilets of probably a building very familiar to the area. I wasn't on the 86th floor, right? But I was in the stalls, and I remember coming home from college. Those were I had 3 summer jobs. I sold knives, I sold vacuums, and I cleaned toilets, right? And and I was a straight A student, right? And so I had it was work, right? If I wanted the life that I saw myself having, I had to work for it. So I think while I'm not a geriatric millennial, I like to consider myself right in the middle, I came right from that generation that said, if you want something, this is what it's going to have to take. And I love that this younger generation is saying, you all did that, and your Social Security is still on, your retirement is still, you've done all of that, you're stressed out, your mental health is not supremely cared for, and what did you get? And so I totally respect that too. So finding that middle ground is important. In your book, you speak about the backlash women face when advocating for themselves. How can young women, especially women of color, navigate spaces where assertiveness might be perceived as aggression?
That's a really good question. Yeah. It's funny because I'm working on a piece right now about how a lot of bosses, my generation, are afraid to be mean because we don't want to be perceived as girl bosses. We don't want to be perceived as bitchy, and it's interesting because some of it is you don't want to replicate toxic workplace dynamics, right? You don't want to you don't want to create an environment where you are holding your team to untenable standards, you have unrealistic expectations, and perpetuating a system right now, which I think a lot of us can say that the current workplace, and many of you are going to be entering the current workplace soon, but it is a model of exploitation. It's how can we get the most out of somebody by paying them and giving them the least support possible? And I think the reason I call the book A Reckoning is I think there's a reckoning happening in our society around that. People are realizing that, and I think it's not just the working poor that are coming into consciousness about our labor conditions. And so we are in a weird moment right now around women in leadership and around kind of asserting yourself. We know that the girl boss, or how we understood the girl boss, was perhaps not the most liberating, right? We know that Lean In did not lead to equality for women in the workplace. And just to contextualize this, Lean In was a very popular book 10, 15 years ago about, I guess 10 years ago now, basically the number 2 at Facebook wrote a book about women's leadership, but this was before like Facebook like destroyed our democracy, so it was very like every feminist was on the op-ed pages defending the book, and now everyone's like, just kidding, like oops, but this very corporate idea of like work hard, and every book is about the same thing. It's about like what to do in that negotiate, like ask for more money, assert yourself in the team meeting, all of these things, and it's like all of workplace feminism has focused on this one thing rather than and individualized it, when what we really need is this kind of collective understanding of what leadership looks like and what the workplace looks like. And I do think that if you're assertive right now, like the consequences feel really dire for that. They feel very like everyone's gonna think I'm girl bossing too close to the sun, or and so I do think it is a little bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't for young women in leadership, and especially for young women of color. But statistically, what we're seeing is that young women leaders tend to be the most collective oriented. They tend to be, their teams are generally the happiest. They feel that they have the most kind of work-life balance. And they have also been the best at kind of implementing DEI across the board. And so I almost think that the question is answering itself, to the extent that I do think that a lot of women, and especially women of color, have figured out how to adapt to the workplace. And that adaptability is really showing itself, I think, in the statistics around leadership. And I think there is some consensus that a certain type of top-down leadership may not be working, but then also, like, I don't know, like to make a project successful, like you kind of do need roles. You need some structure. You need, you need a pecking order, right? And so it's interesting because I had a conversation recently with a business leader, and she was kind of like, I don't know that like we know what the answer is yet in terms of what this leadership model is supposed to look like. But I do know, and I know this also personally, having managed teams in super high stress environments, there needs to be one person that's telling everyone what to do. Like there needs to be one person who holds the vision, And that doesn't mean that everyone under you feels disempowered or feels exploited or isn't, like, you should always be advocating for your team as much as possible. But we do need some kind of leadership. And so it's really figuring out like what that assertiveness can look like in a way that is functional and productive.
I love that. It actually reminds me of me in my workplace. I am the eldest on my staff. I'm 36. So, right, I came into this role with a decade of experience. I worked for 3 mayors and a judge in Atlanta, Georgia, and in various different departments. So I got to see how the public and private work together from a business standpoint, from the civil standpoint, and also own 2 of my own businesses. So I've definitely got enough, experience. But now leading my own team and everyone kind of being younger, so their experience is less, right? Their expertise is still fairly new. I had and wonderful staff, might I add, but I know that just in terms of what it is that we're used to. I have an assistant who I asked, can you make this check out? I just need to sign it, go ahead and mail it out. And she knows, she's kind of our thing, Deshanna likes to double, triple check. So she sent a picture of the check to me. And she just, like how she wrote it out, kind of made me, she probably has never actually had to use a checkbook, right? Like, and it wasn't, terrible, but I could just, in her mind of what she thought needed to be there. Yeah. So it immediately put me in a space of the generational changes, right? There, we have to have that structure in place. I often say, I need someone older than me here because I need to be able to ask, how does this actually work? Or, someone a little bit more senior. So it's not about having the pressure of having a role where someone is that, bitchy and kind of directing everyone, but it is about having that infrastructure where folks feel safe, feel called in, but have something that they can have, a landing pad almost.
I love that.
So, yeah.
That just reminded me of another difference. We had phones in our dorm rooms. We didn't have cell phones.
Right.
Can you imagine?
Yep, you had to find it. Yes.
My mom was calling that phone, and I was in the library.
Yeah. At my institution, there were hallway phones. Okay, so there was no
right. That might have been a hallway phone.
Inside, you had to use the hallway phone. And so people would call and get off the phone with your boyfriend. My mom is calling me in 5 minutes, right?
Oh my God, that's right. Oh my God.
Yes. taking it back, right? So you kind of answered this, but I, give you a chance to kind of elongate that. How do you see modern day feminism addressing workplace issues, particularly the intersection of race and gender?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I tackle quite a bit in the book, and I will say that education definitely started at SUNY Albany, is, I think there's this mainstream conception of feminism right now that is very identity focused, right? Where anything is gravy if a woman is doing it, right? And I do think that people are a little fed up with that narrative. Like, if I mean, I think even coming out of the debate on Tuesday, people weren't talking about Kamala's race and gender. People were just not talking about that stuff the way that we were. We all know it, right? But we're not letting ourselves get burned by that again, right? And I think that is one of the things that modern, and I think there's so many different kinds of feminism, and there's so many different, feminism is so much, and something I really learned here and also in my grad education, so much of it is critique, right? So much of it is taking what we have understood and kind of really, trying to create a more inclusive ideology and theory and how it kind of plays into practice. And I think one of the things I really trace in the book, and I spend a lot of time thinking about this, is this kind of neoliberal workplace feminism, the kind of lean in, all that matters is that women get ahead, because if women get ahead, then that's going to be great for all women. And we've kind of been taught that forever. And the part that we don't talk about is that for certain women to get ahead, other women don't get ahead, right? And, and one of the things that Betty Friedan, who kind of, the feminist from the 1960s, who wrote The Feminine Mystique, her book was really about educated white women in the suburbs who had gone to college and decided to be housewives, right? And the dissatisfaction they had in that experience, right? And so it's really about on the problem that has no name, right? Famously. And so it's really about getting those women into the workplace. And in order for those women to get into the workplace, there's another underclass of women that had to come up and take care of their children and clean their houses and cook their meals for them, right? And pick up their kids after school, and and so those women become invisible in that kind of line of modern mainstream feminism. And I think that has continued to be true. So when you think about Lean In, she talks about it, and she's just yeah, I have a nanny, and I have, and so it's almost like those women don't get to have careers and ambitions. It's really just, when we think about ambition, we're all working to kind of get to this one place, but then it always produces this underclass of people. And I think I really traced back where this kind of neoliberal idea of feminism came from in the book. And there really was this moment where, the suffragists made a decision. There was Black feminists and working class feminists that were asking, the kind of more affluent women that were fighting for the women's right to vote, and a very important and necessary fight, but they kind of made a strategic decision to have it be specifically about the needs of wealthy white women. And so feminism really split in that moment. And so, but when you trace the roots of socialist feminism or a more working class feminism, it's all about collective uprising, right? It's all about this kind of collective idea that yeah, you can get ahead as an individual, but if you're not supporting every woman around you, then we're not coming up as a collective. We're not all going to be supported. And the workplace has found a way to perpetuate that, where we are taught that if there's another woman at the table, and this is also something that I think is very exciting about younger generations that are refusing this, right? But we always felt there's one seat at that table and it's gonna be me. It's not gonna be another woman, it's gonna be me. And it kind of sets us up for this inherent competition. But we're actually more powerful together, right? When we say together, we're actually not going to put up with this. They can't fire all of us, right? And so that's, what to me, where a modern workplace feminism needs to go is to really think about the collective. And I don't just mean that in I do think it's a spiritual, I think it's spiritual, I think it's cultural, but I also think it's practical. We really are not going to actually get the workplaces that speak to all of our needs if I say, oh, I've decided that I've changed my relationship to ambition, I'm not going to do as much. But Nancy next to me is I'll take all her work and do all of it. It's well, then we're not changing anything. Now I'm just lazy and so it really has to be a collective experience.
It has to become culture. And I think that is the name of the game, right? We have to take these things out of conversation and put them into actual practice. So in your book, you quoted someone, and I can't recall, but you said that diversity and a seat at the table is not enough, right? If those policies at that institution isn't changed, if your CEO, if your board, if everyone is not aligned, then it's just a check mark, right? It's just making sure we've done it because we've now inserted this DEI mission statement that we need to fulfill, right? There's a grant that we've got to accomplish. It becomes just a list of things. And you mentioned an example about some Google employees, right? Feeling that. I have a very good friend who felt that. She's now at LinkedIn and having a wonderful time. But she felt that I was a token hire. And so I had to consistently prove myself and my worth of being here because I was hired at a time where they were doing diversity hires, right? And so you create this unknowingly culture, right, where there is that constant competition. And so what you also just explained went right into my next set of questions, which is my favorite part of the book, chapter 6. So read chapter 6 and then read everything else, right? Start from the beginning. But when I got to chapter 6, I was listening to this on audiobook, and I have to go back and forth to New York City quite often, usually on the weekends. And so I've listened to this twice through now. And chapter 6 is the diversity industrial complex. And you put out so much stats and just so much truth, and I was just like, Samhita, girl, yes. But what it brought to me was just kind of all of the things that, let me tell you, kind of give you some context. So I grew up in the Capital Region, but I decided to attend an HBCU. So I'm on a campus with 3 other institutions that are all HBCUs. I then graduate there and I work for the mayor of Atlanta, who is of color, and then 3 mayors after that who are all of color. And then I decided to leave that position and go work for a judge who was my mentor, who got me the first job with first mayor, right? A woman of color, right? And so I was surrounded from the mayor to the janitor, everyone looked like me. So I had this kind of reverse experience from many of the generations before me, where I was in an environment and in this bubble where I was padded and protected, and I got to see the best, the range, right, of our diversity and our offerings. And I came back to the Capital Region, and I was a CEO in a position and in a role where there aren't many Black female leaders or female CEOs overall. I think corporately nationwide, it's less than 6%, less than 5% female leadership. And so when I got to this particular chapter, I was like, okay, she's speaking my language. I know the statistics say that Black women work 20% harder for nothing. Literally no increased revenue, no increased recognition, just because we feel we have to. Just because, right, somebody else is gonna put it down and then you're gonna be called on to do that. What I also learned in my data research is that they say diverse teams typically are 40% more profitable. And so while diversity isn't enough by itself, but if you have an entire structure that is catered towards that, you will see better results. In chapter 6, you highlight the fact that Black women often experience negative effects of workplace inequalities more acutely than others. Can you talk about why this is and what systems in place continue to perpetuate this disparity?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was kind of hard writing these chapters because they were so statistic heavy, and I was a little anxious. Like that was the stuff that was like the stickiest to write about from a personal experience, because I would never be like, yeah, that person hired me because I was a person of color, but like it kind of felt like that sometimes. And then there were different moments in my leadership where I was expected to do things because I felt like my white bosses didn't want to, like, somehow like every person of color just like reported to me, and I was like, how is that? Like, that can't be a coincidence. Like, this isn't just my department. And, and some of it was these kind of soft narratives that I think continue in the workplace around leadership and around, what people are willing to do. Like, I think that there is this expectation, especially for women and women of color in the workplace, that well, she'll just do it. I mean, she has to do it. She needs the job, she'll just do it. And it is, part of it is a sense of entitlement, and I think this kind of, and it's really baked into the culture. Like, it's not something that, like, I don't think we make these individual choices where it's like, I am gonna work harder than everybody else here because I love being exploited. It's like, no, there's kind of this quiet narrative that, if you're a Black woman, that you're going to accept less pay, and you're going to accept the conditions that are egregious, and you're going to smile and bear it, and that's just like part of the culture in the workplace, and that's why a lot of DEI programs are unsuccessful, because they're not structural, right? You can't expect one Google employee to come in and change the racism that's embedded in a tech company from generations of not hiring diversely and creating a system that is sustainable or inclusive of that diversity. And tech is a complicated one too, because I think that tech is diverse, right? It is racially diverse, but it's not economically diverse, and it's not, it's predominantly, not predominantly, but there are opportunities for Asian people in tech that often, like, Black and Latino people don't get, and there are many cultural and historical reasons for that. But even the people, like, even Asian Americans or Asians in tech companies are paid statistically less than white programmers next to them. And so a lot of these issues are embedded within these organizations. They're not, and one of the people I interviewed for that chapter is the sociologist Victor Ray, who writes about, I'm blanking on the name of his paper, but it's basically about how companies today reflect the same racial dynamics that we've had in this country for the last 300 years, and Black racial capitalism, basically, or like racialized capitalism, and so racialized institutions, that's what he calls them. And so if you map organizations across the board and look at racial inequality, they essentially reflect the same dynamics that you had on, like, slave plantations. The lowest paid are the poorest and come from the most geographically vulnerable places, and then the upper kind of, the C-suite is predominantly wealthy white men, like all of those kind of structures are the same. And in order for any of these DEI initiatives to be successful, in order for, like, we, and I wrote an essay about Kamala about this, because, this idea of the glass cliff. And so one of the concepts I engage with in the book is the kind of, like, post-George Floyd diversity hire, right? Like, we've had a history of, racial inequality in this business, so now we have, a woman of color CEO, and she's gonna change everything, and then she doesn't, and she manages to, like, make enemies of, like, even the people of color at the company, because she alone was not able to change, and I feel like that's kind of what Kamala's up against right now, right? Like, there's a very high chance of failure here, and and there's this expectation that, like, now this, like, Black and Asian woman is going to save us, this big mess that all these old white men made. And so I think that, to, like, finally answer your question, sorry. But, like, I think that is, right now we're in this moment where a few of us will get put in these leadership positions, and then when we fail, it'll be like, and that's why we shouldn't have hired you, instead of the lesson being, like, what were the structures in place to have me actually be successful, for me to be successful, and to be, effective in actually diversifying this workplace.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. I know that I am consistently dealing with that now. We are the third iteration of a chamber here in the Capital Region, of a Black chamber, I should say. There is a more mainstream one, has about 2,700 members, and it's so funny when I get into these rooms. The Albany Black Chamber literally just began in 2022, and our membership opened October 2023. I just met with some hopeful investors and some sponsors, and they're just like, well, what's going on, right? You guys are open, and we just crossed our threshold of having 100 members, and that is an accomplishment when we're thinking about the demographic of Black businesses that actually exist, many being micro businesses, really celebrated hobbies at best because of their lack of resources, their lack of access. And so when I met with these questions of, I guess it's not going as good. And I'm like, actually, we're doing well. But if you put us up against an institution that has 135 years and a multi-million-dollar budget, then I guess, by those metrics, we aren't. But if we had the same access, oh baby, we'd be rolling, right? And so I totally understand that concept of when we are fine, or when we do have the opportunity to have that advantage, the stakes are much higher and the goalposts often move.
Yeah.
So going into what role do you think companies and institutions should play in addressing not just gender inequality, but the racial dynamics that leave Black women particularly vulnerable in professional settings?
Yeah, sorry, say the first part of that again.
No, what role do you think companies and institutions should play in addressing not just gender inequality, but the racial dynamics?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that it needs to be really top down. I think right now we put untenable expectations on entry-level employees, people that don't have a ton of power, or these kind of non-supported leaders and often we internalize it too, right? I mean, I think that when I got the Teen Vogue job, I was not expecting the South Asian press to lose their minds. I was not expecting that everyone would be like, this is a historic moment, first South Asian, I was like, first of all, it's literally 2020. What are we talking about right now? Yeah. But I wasn't, and so I bought into it. I was like, wait, this is history, this is exciting. And the truth is, it is, right? It is really important for having this kind of diverse representation and to put people in those roles, but then also finding ways to support people that are in those roles. And so, I always think about when I hire, obviously in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about, I always prioritize SUNY students, I'm not gonna lie, that's off the record. But I'm like, I know this person knows how to work hard. They know what it's like to not have everything, and sorry. I keep having all these stories from the 90s, but I love showing my employees the one desktop computer my suite mates and I shared. Because we didn't even have laptops. Never know. But I always think about there's this kind of unspoken, what we call a culture fit in the workplace. And I always tackle that because I've had so many CEOs be like, well, are they a culture fit? And I'm like, you're just another white dude who went to Harvard. What culture are you talking? I don't know. It's we have to be really specific when we say things like that. And, and so I always think about am I hiring somebody and I'm willing to do, so, especially when I used to work at this company called Mike before Teen Vogue, and they did, they were what were they, the millennial news outlet for the New York Times for the millennial. I can't remember what our tagline was, but it was the perfect, it was we got $90 million, and then 3 years later the company shut down. And it was the perfect late outs, just sad digital graveyard, whatever. But I got to hire a really diverse team there because they were oh, when we write about race, it does really well on Facebook. And I was like, okay, I'll take it where I can get it, fine, And so I had the opportunity to hire, up and coming journalists that covered issues, Black Lives Matter was a big issue at that point, Indigenous issues, Islamophobia, immigration, and I'm interviewing all of these kind of whatever you would call diverse candidates, and many of them, I was like, they're not going to think this is a culture fit. This is not somebody who went to an elite university. They're not connected. They don't have a lot of relationships in media. And they are going to require extra mentoring from me. I am signing up to do more work myself by bringing this person on. And that is a lot to ask of a middle manager, right? And if there had been anything there, an HR department, let's be real, startups, that's the last place they invest money. It needs to be the first. But, if they had an HR department, if they had some kind of person on staff to be even the most basic things of making comments about people's lunches, I did the most basic microaggressions that are distracting for you when you're 23, 24 years old, and you're why is this person, why is this person talking to me like this? It's and to just even have that training and have it in a way that's actually effective. And right now, most DEI training in the workplace is like you take an unconscious bias class and everyone's like, I think we can all agree that racism is bad. And you're like, oh, bad, check. Okay, you saw, everyone's good. And you're like, great, like we all know it's bad. And, you know, and that's the extent of it, right? But what we don't have is how to have a difficult conversation with someone who works for you and you're afraid that they're gonna call you racist. Or maybe you're gonna be racist and you don't wanna be. And so how do you have that moment? And I recently interviewed this company for Inc., like for the Inc. 5000, and they are basically this like 2 young women of color that are using AI to do DEI trainings. And what it does is like there's a module that you basically interact with and you have a fake conversation with this person. So you're like, okay, like the simulation they brought me through is like, Anthony has been sitting in meetings and he's talking over women all the time. How do you have that conversation? I've been in that situation before where I'm like, how do I tell this person? They're gonna really react badly if I dare suggest that they're sexist. And so how do you have that conversation? And it brings you through a series of prompts, and if you do it wrong, they're like, try again, he's getting disconnected. Try this, you know, and so that's something I've really been thinking about is like, how do we create workplace cultures, and I do think this needs to come from the top, where we get comfortable having uncomfortable conversations. Because that's really what it is. Like a lot of times, people want to do the right things, a lot of times. Most people I know don't actually want to be racist, right? Like they just are. Sorry. It's just like these biases function in subconscious and conscious ways. And so how do you kind of diminish those or diminish the power of them? And, you know, and it's not always, like I also think the opposite is now happening where, and I've been thinking about this a lot, it's like, you don't want to say the wrong thing, right? Like my boss like has a very hard time with they them, right? Like, and I'm just like, or not even like many bosses that I've had, and you know, like I've noticed that like older generations have a hard time with like gender pronouns, right? Yes. And so you get it wrong, like so freaking what? Like just say I'm sorry, and then be like, what are your preferred? You know, I'm so sorry I did that. Like, you know, obviously I know this is, and I have like a very personal example in the book about this because I was called the wrong South Asian executive in a meeting, in a very high level meeting. And, you know, and it's like the way that the company dealt with it versus what they could have done, which is like, she should have just apologized. She should have just been like, God, of course, Samhita, like what a mistake, didn't mean to do it. And, you know, instead it was a complete waste of resources, a waste of DEI resources, you know, but really that's what it comes down to. It's like, how do we start having, like, the more diverse and racially and financially and gender diverse our workplaces are, the stronger and better they are. We know that. But not if half those people feel disenfranchised and disempowered.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've been grappling with that. I'm glad you brought up that that moment that you had with that executive, because it's so often it happens, and I think we talk about it in our circles, but not in major platforms enough. So when people are here, they're just kind of like, really? And it's like, you know, this stuff happens every day. But yes, to be identified just because you all share the same, you know, background in terms of your ethnicity, but you look nothing alike, right? Like you know, and these people know, right? So whether it was just a genuine mistake or an intentional one, either way it should be dealt with. I deal with it all the time with my name and its spelling. My name is spelled Deshanna, and I have gotten that spelled so many different ways. Also, it's in my signature, and I've got DE-S-HANNAU. It's so many different, and I'm just like, it's right here for you. It's right, you know, here for you to see. And so what I've decided to do, and I've not yet figured out if it's a passive aggressive thing, but I just said, can you tell me where you saw that spelling? Because I'd love to make sure that we get it corrected so that we don't have that happen again, right? But I think that there is just so many, you know, you also spoke about how that negative, people love to talk about race online, whether it's negative or positive. There was a news station, which I will not mention because I do not want anyone coming for me, that literally reached out to us and said during our Juneteenth celebration this year that they got the most activation on their Facebook page because they showcased us celebrating Juneteenth, and most of it was negative. Why are they wanting to celebrate this fake holiday? They should return that club to the people it belonged to, in writing, with their names attached, and with 3,000 comments. This is the most engagement they've ever had on a post. And they wanted my response, and I said, well, that's great. Let's make sure that they all understand what it is we do here, right? And so I had my communications person reply to every one of them. This is our membership, right? Come on and see what's happening, right? And how much, engagement. But if we don't call it to the carpet, if we are not dealing with it and are comfortable having these uncomfortable conversations, we won't cross that threshold. So I really love the points that you made here. Paul is here, so we're going to wrap it right away. Okay. We're going to open
All these
to the
students have a
students.
lot of questions.
Yeah.
So
Only have,
thank you, Samhita, so
Thank
much.
you.
We're going to open this up to the Q&A.
I didn't even realize so much time went. I could talk to you
We can
forever.
talk all day.
I'm going to borrow a
Please.
microphone.
Yeah.
All right.
We can share this one.
Raise your hand and ask it succinctly so we can get to as many questions as we can. Thank you.
My name is Louis Davis. I just want to ask, how you figure out what to do once you leave college, because I'm having a hard enough time figuring out my major.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. Part of what I was saying is I think there is this expectation that you figure it out right away, and I don't necessarily know that you'll know, right? I think I changed my major here 3 times, if I'm honest. Definitely. My mom's maybe 4. I think I started in political science, sociology. I think I had a ill-fated semester in economics. Just a lot of figuring it out and figuring out who I was. And yeah, I think I do think one thing that I do want to say is most of us have to find jobs after college. I think the most important thing is that there's a paycheck attached to it at first, right? And so you may not necessarily know right away. You may just have to, experiment and figure out what the next step should be. And like I said, I joined AmeriCorps when I graduated because I had no idea what I was going to do. And I did some volunteering and internships and things like that, but I had to make money. I think I worked at a coffee shop, and then I lived on the Clearwater, and then eventually I was a public school teacher for 7 years. Where I got I was a substitute teacher, and then I got an emergency credential. Thank you, America, and and all of that has contributed. Now, I mean, if you can run a kindergarten class, you can run a team, right? And so now it's all of those skills kind of helped out. And so I would almost really map out what are the things that intrigue you? What makes you curious? I mean, what are you studying right now? Biology. I mean, you have better advice than me on what to do.
What's your advice for underrepresented individuals or minorities, women, people of color, to make it in the workplace? What do you give as advice for those people when they are going into the workforce? Because you said one person that's a minority going in would not make a difference. So what would make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. They're this speaker said, I can't make a difference. The one piece of advice that I always tell people, because I think I used to give the opposite advice, and now I feel differently looking back in the last 20 years of my career, which is I used to tell people to fake it till they make it. And what I didn't realize was embedded in that is this idea that you hadn't made it already, that you had to fake it, and that there was somebody who was not faking it, because the other thing you'll learn is everybody at work is faking it. Nobody knows what they're doing. and it's both devastating to learn that, and also it's refreshing, because you're oh, we're all faking it. And the reason I say that is because just being at the table is making it. Just showing up every day is you putting yourself out there, and you trying to learn, and you trying to navigate a new environment. And I'm not saying that we as individuals can't have tremendous impact in the work that we do, but I also think it's very easy to get lost in these systems, and there's this expectation that you have to go above and beyond, and you have to show, and especially I think as young women, I mean, one of the things I always think about in my leadership is there were so many moments I feel people just didn't treat me right because they thought I was younger than I was, and they'd be if only one of the managers was here, and I'm I run the brand, I'm the manager, I'm the boss, and so I used to always feel I had to assert myself in every table, and I had to take over every conversation, and obviously I'm chatty, and it's easy for me to do, but it's okay to just be there. It's okay to be there and learn and observe. And it takes 100 days to know what a job is about, truly, to understand the inner workings, to understand the psychology, to understand, who actually has the power. It's not who you think it is, that kind of stuff. And so I think it's okay to not feel like we have to barrel into every job and be like so assertive and just be so on top of it. It's like, it's okay to just show up, learn, do your best, and then as you learn from that, you will figure out the different moments to kind of assert yourself.
We've got one more question, then we will have one more, but I'll remind you the books are for sale, and you can continue the conversation. Samhita would be happy to sign your books there, so you can come up and ask your question. I know some of you have to get to your next class or other things. We're at an hour, but we will have at least one more question and then one more after that. Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned to make a point of basically kind of just being there and not trying to barrel into every opportunity. I'm kind of having an opposite problem with Lewis over there. This morning I went to my advisor and I picked a third major. So how would you go about getting used to kind of just being where you're at and not, or understanding when it's your turn to kind of go forward, or when is your time to kind of just sit where you are?
To sit back. Yeah, that's such a good question. And I actually, I feel like you're kind of answering the question even in asking it, because this is something I really struggle with. I have so many different interests, and it's kind of when do I know which thing to focus on and when not to? And just to give you an idea, as though I could even answer this question, right now I have a job that pays my salary and gives me health benefits. I also am working on a podcast. I also am working on another book, and I also write articles. And the articles I write that get the most attention aren't even about the topic of my book. I'm constantly doing interviews about something totally different, and I feel absolutely crazy all the time. But but it has been and some of it is I'm not young anymore, so I can't do everything anymore, and so some of it has just been forced, where I have to prioritize. But it's been this tremendous lesson in mapping out where needs my energy and where does not in those moments, and where it's okay for one of my projects to be a little dormant and take a little time, or when honestly I need to just be honest about what I'm actually capable of in that moment and how much energy I can put into everything. And there are moments when I was writing the book, I would say for 2 years of it, I was working and writing the book. And that's fine, I was pushing the book forward. But to actually land the book, I needed to take 6 months off from everything. I went to a small cottage in the woods. It was a little scary. And then I did an artist residency, AKA an artist residency. And then I literally went to a beach town and just focused on the book. And then I knew that energetically in that moment, all of those other things had to go to the wayside, because when you're really passionate and focused about one thing and you need to land it, you need to just fully live in the world of it. And it's such an important, I think it's so important for us to have 3 majors. I actually think that's great, and I think it's awesome that you are, because you're really learning. You're taking the opportunity, you have access to all of this, and you're taking the opportunity to really learn and experiment and be curious with all of those different things. And then you'll start to reveal to yourself, oh, okay, when I do this, that makes me feel good. When I do this one, not as much. Or sometimes, it's not going to feel good, but writing a book doesn't really feel good. You just have to do it. But I know that I will feel good when it's done. And, and you really start to map that out. And sometimes, you just have to do it because it's paying your paycheck. And you're and you can do that for some time too. But then you're well, this is kind of boring and I want to do something else, and really map it out that way.
Here's our next to last question.
Yes.
Yeah, hi. I have a question that circles back to a lot of feminist speaking points you were talking about, and I just want to preface by saying I haven't read the book, so I'm so sorry if you cover this, but there's been a lot of rhetoric circling online lately about how women, especially in relationships, are expected to take on the emotional burden when it comes to maintaining their home, maintaining their partner's appointments and tasks, and they also have to go to work and balance the mental load there as well. And I was just wondering if you had any opinions on that, and how the modern woman is expected to do almost double than she was expected to do, decades ago.
Yeah. I do write about that quite extensively, and really this expectation. And I guess I would say, I think that one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was I felt like the way that we talk about the idea of women having it all was at the sacrifice of women's emotional well-being, right? It was yeah, like I'm exhausted and I'm like killing it at work and I'm like an awesome parent and I'm like going to Soul Cycle every day, but like I'm dying inside, you know? And that's the reality that I think most, especially working mothers, and I think that really came to a head during the pandemic where, you know, a lot of moms were like, why do I work this hard and now I have to homeschool this child? Like, what is happening right now? Like, I don't want to do this. And I think that there's a lot of things we lose when we assume that women will carry the emotional load of care work. I think first and foremost, we need to acknowledge that care work is work and it is emotional. It is, and frankly, all work is emotional. I also think there's a lot of men that want to be involved in care work, right? Like my partner is actually prioritizes parenting over his career, and that's been a really interesting lesson because I'm like, can't relate, you know. So I think that we are at this place where I think that, you know, we're ready to have this conversation around how much care work men do versus how much care work women do, and how to kind of really start to demystify that line, because I think that we also glamorize it. Like we're like, oh, she's so caring, she's so great, she does so. Half the time I'm like, I don't want to do this, I have to do it, you know. And I think that, you know, and often we, like, you know, you guys follow this trad wife stuff, you know, trad wives, like that whole like romanticization of like parenting, and meanwhile these women, like, we're all like, blink if you're okay, like it's like clearly they're like not doing well in their relationships. You know, and so I think this is one of those things where it feels like in conversation the veil has been lifted, but then when you look at the numbers, women still statistically do most of the child care, and often now, again, as many of you will face, like we also take care of our parents while taking care of our kids, and that's also why like a lot of women aren't having kids anymore, you know, like statistically we're just not, or we're having them much later because it's very hard to kind of quote do it all. And that's something I talk about a lot in the book, where it's not about having it all. It really, if you want to have it all, that means you actually have to do it all, and that's what people I think are rebelling against right now.
Here's our last question.
Yes.
Hi, you talked about earlier about different generations, how they have different mindsets. Like you talked about Gen X compared to millennial mindsets. Is there any like advice you could give to like the Gen Zers or like the Gen Alpha people who are about to enter the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, and I said this a little bit earlier, but this idea of like, so how do I say this? So I love that so many of my younger employees over the years have a very strong sense of work-life balance. I respect it, and I think it's really important, and I understand that, you know, I understand that the model that has functioned for a long time, which is that I'll just give you everything I want, especially for entry level. It's like, I'm just going to work above and beyond, and you're going to notice me, and then, you know, someone's going to hand me that thing, and then I'm going to run the company one day, right? Like, started off as a cashier, now I'm the CEO. What's the company that I can't remember. There was a recent story about this. You know, so I think there needs to be a balance between kind of hustle culture and the type of exploitative labor practice that's been very glamorized as like work, you know, beyond your means. And I mean, when you look at what quiet quitting actually was, you know what people were saying? They were like, I'm just going to do the job I was hired for. That's literally what people were saying, right? And so I think that, you know, and I think this kind of dovetails with the question that you were asking about all the majors. I think there's going to be moments when you can be like, I'm not going to go above and beyond, right? But then there's also going to be moments, like if the boss is sitting in the presentation, that's the moment to go above and beyond, right? Like there are going to be moments, and I think it's really finding that balance of like, yes, you should have a voice, yes, you should articulate your boundaries, and yes, some of the things that we work on, and this is especially true because I work in a creative field, and like when you're closing an issue, or, you know, there's just work that's happening, right? Or like I work on a lot of events, and like right now we're working 24/7 because we have an event coming up. So there's going to be moments when you do have to kind of stretch yourself, and then there's moments where you can be like, no, I'm actually not going to. And I feel like understanding that balance is really important, rather than having this really severe, kind of fairly theoretical sense of like what a boundary should be in the workplace.